A single unsigned report from 1842 is found in the Texas archives describing a Negro fugitive who left no survivors. It references 3 plantation murders, but no official case or name. Local registries show a slave named Isaac Granger listed under 3 different owners across Texas. Each died violently within months, but no trace of Isaac's sale or birth exists. A half-burned notebook found in a sheriff's estate reveals details of a man who kills only when the whip cracks. It's dated 2 years after Isaac was declared dead. A surviving overseer's son later confesses that his father saw Isaac alive, not in Texas, but in Louisiana using a different name, working on a steamboat crew. A hidden signature in a church ledger matches handwriting found in the sheriff's burned journal. It proves Isaac was literate, a capital crime for slaves, suggesting premeditation and rebellion. Newly discovered newspaper fragments mention an entire homestead burned overnight. Eyewitnesses saw a tall black man in chains walking into the fire. The date matches Isaac's final known location. A deathbed letter from Isaac's final owner is discovered. He said he doesn't kill for freedom, he kills for balance. But the handwriting at the bottom isn't the master's, it's Isaac's. If you want to explore more hidden histories, forgotten figures, and dark secrets that history tried to erase, then subscribing to this channel is your first step. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story that challenges what you think you know. Each like you give helps us reach more people who crave the strange, the forbidden, and the unbelievable truths that linger in the shadows of time. We want to hear from you too. Did Isaac truly survive, or did his legend live on in the fear he instilled? Could the chains of history ever really be broken, or do some stories demand to be whispered for generations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights, theories, and questions are part of the conversation that keeps these stories alive. Every click, every comment, every view helps uncover more of the hidden world around us. So join us, subscribe, like, comment. Become part of the journey through the shadows of history, where each secret revealed opens another door, and you never know what you might find waiting behind it. If the truth can vanish for 200 years, what else is buried under silence? They said his name was Isaac, though no one could ever prove he'd been born. No birth record, no plantation ledger, no bill of sale that survived long enough to show who first claimed him. Yet the Texas archives hold a single page, creased, stained with water, and unsigned. It tells of a man who left no survivors. Dated 1842. No description. No known origin. Only a warning written in trembling script. He walks before the fire. The report was filed by a county sheriff in Bastrop, who disappeared 2 weeks later. His office was found empty, papers burned, chair overturned. What remained was that one note. Local historians dismissed it as superstition, one more ghost story from a violent frontier. But buried in the same archive drawer lay something stranger, a set of plantation death reports, 3 owners, 3 counties apart. Each killed within months of acquiring a new slave named Isaac. Each death ruled an accident. In the first report, dated February 1841, a cotton baron named William Dean was found with his throat slit by a blade so sharp it left no drag marks. The slaves on his property swore they saw nothing. Only one man was missing, a field worker Dean had bought the previous spring. His description: tall, strong build, scar above the left wrist. The sheriff's note said he must have run north, maybe toward Oklahoma Territory. But no one ever found him. 8 months later, another death. Brazos County. Owner's name: Harlan Pierce, his skull crushed by an iron weight. The plantation house set aflame. In the ashes, investigators found the charred outline of a chain, broken clean at the link. And again, one man missing. The ledgers listed him as Isaac, but the handwriting in the ledger didn't match the overseer's usual scrawl. It was smoother, more deliberate, almost elegant. Someone had written the name carefully, as if practicing it. Historians would later realize all 3 owners had purchased their slaves from the same traveling broker out of Galveston, a man known only as Mr. Cobb. Cobb kept no permanent office, no family records. He vanished after 1842, leaving behind a warehouse burned to its frame. The city called it an accident. But witnesses remembered seeing a man walking away from the flames, wrists bleeding, holding a piece of paper that glowed orange in the firelight. It was around this time that the stories began, the ones whispered between towns. Stories of a man who appeared in the night, chains dragging behind him, eyes like candlelight. He'd show up on plantations just before tragedy struck. Some said he wasn't a man at all, but a punishment sent to the masters who had forgotten mercy. Others swore he was real, a runaway who knew the land better than any hunter, who hid by day and moved by smoke at night. When the Texas Historical Commission reopened the archive box in 1989, the air inside smelled of old wood and rain. They found one more detail missed by previous curators, a watermark on the unsigned report's paper. It bore the insignia of the Confederate Provisional Army, even though the date on the page was nearly 20 years before the Confederacy existed. That single fact suggested the page had been rewritten or replaced later, perhaps to conceal something. And in the corner of the paper, under magnification, were faint indentations, words pressed by another page that had once lain above it. The impression read, "Keep his name erased. Locals from the old plantations tell a consistent detail, the smell." Survivors claimed that moments before their masters' deaths, the air filled with the scent of rust and wet soil, as if a storm had just passed. Dogs wouldn't bark. Horses refused to move. Then came the silence, thick and endless, and afterward, only the glow of something burning in the fields. A letter discovered in 1904 by a railroad worker in Nacogdoches described the scene of one such night. The author, an overseer named Josiah Keene, wrote to his wife, "I seen him by the corn rows. The moon hit the iron round his wrists, and I thought it was lightning. He didn't run, just watched me till I turned away. When I looked again, the house was already aflame." The letter was never mailed. Keene was found dead 2 days later, his throat packed with ash. By the 1840s, Texas was still young, rough, full of lawless ground and men trying to build kingdoms out of dust. Plantations rose like fortresses guarded by guns and fear. In that world, a runaway slave who killed even one white man would have been hunted for sport. Yet this man, this Isaac, seemed to move untouched, crossing counties, leaving no trail except the dead. It's as if he understood not only how to vanish, but how to erase every trace of himself. Some modern researchers believe he had help. An abolitionist group operating out of New Orleans, known later as the Southern Vigil, was said to forge documents, smuggle fugitives north, and feed misinformation to bounty hunters. But there's no record that they ever worked this far west. One retired archivist suggested something more personal, that Isaac wasn't running from something, but towards someone. Every plantation he struck shared a link, a single name that appeared in the trade paperwork of all three murdered masters. Brokerage witness, Monsieur Cobb. Who was Cobb? A slave trader, a con man, or something darker. A man profiting from flesh, reshaping identities, falsifying bills of sale for the highest bidder. Some whispered that he'd built his fortune by selling the same man over and over under different names. If that were true, then Isaac's story wasn't random. It was revenge against the entire chain that had turned him into property again and again. Whisper, "He kills only when owned." That phrase would appear decades later in a burned sheriff's journal, the same one found near Bastrop. But here at the beginning it's still a rumor, a piece of folklore from the edges of Texas where paper burned faster than truth could travel. The truth is, no one ever saw Isaac die. No grave, no body, no trial, just fires, 3 of them, and the rumor of a man who appeared between them, silent, watching, walking before the fire. The paradox begins there, in the space between history and fear. How can a man exist in official documents, yet not exist at all? How can 3 deaths, 3 counties apart, share one impossible name? And why, more than a century later, does the archive still hold that single unsigned page, trembling under glass, as if the paper itself remembers what the men who wrote it tried to forget? By the time researchers returned to the Texas archives to investigate the pattern, they were convinced Isaac had been a myth. But the records didn't lie. They only contradicted each other. In 3 separate county registries, the same name appeared in the same year, Isaac Granger. Each listed him as newly acquired property, male, approximately 30, skilled in field work. Each entry written by a different hand, and each followed by a marginal note written later. Owner deceased. Estate unsettled. What struck the historians most wasn't just the coincidence of the deaths, it was that no document confirmed Isaac's origin. The usual bill of sale, signed by the seller, witnessed by the county clerk, was missing. Instead, every entry was transcribed secondhand from word of mouth. It was as though someone had dictated the purchase details to multiple clerks, each copying down the same name from a voice behind the door. The man called Isaac, one plantation record reads, of unknown origin, brought in good health. But the registrar's handwriting hesitates at the word unknown, the quill leaving a small ink blot. As if the writer had paused, reconsidered, then moved on. The search expanded. Census documents, slave manifests, steamboat ledgers. No Isaac Granger in Texas before 1840. None listed in Louisiana, Mississippi, or Alabama, though the surname Granger appeared often among freed blacks in Virginia. But no man matching his description. As one historian put it, it's like someone invented him, then kept rewriting him into history until the ink ran dry. That theory might have died quietly if not for a letter discovered in 1974 among the private papers of Judge Nathaniel Wren, who presided over Bastrop County in the early 1840s. The letter, dated June 12, 1842, was addressed to a Mr. Cobb of Galveston. In it, Wren warns, "Your subject is again at large. The men you sent to recapture him are dead. I suggest you cease transactions under the Granger name. The record will not hold another death." The letter changed everything. It confirmed not only that Isaac was real, but that his existence was a known problem, one being quietly managed through paperwork and silence. Music, slow pulse, 40% volume. One archivist described the chain of events as a game of identity laundering. Slave traders in that period often reused the same false identities to move human property across county lines, especially if a slave had a record of violence. Changing names hid that history, increasing profit. But in Isaac's case, something reversed. The identity wasn't hiding his crimes. It was hiding their deaths. Each time an owner died, someone rewrote the documents, reinstating Isaac as newly purchased under a new master. That's where the mystery deepens. If he was the same man, someone had to forge the papers, sell him again, and convince the next buyer he was legitimate. But no broker would take such risk unless there was profit or fear. And Cobb's name appears every time, always in the witness line, sometimes abbreviated, sometimes written in full, Matthew Cobb, broker of persons. There's a theory among the historians who study this case that Cobb had lost control of what he created. He'd used Isaac's name as a phantom, a placeholder in fake bills of sale to balance his books, never expecting the real man behind it to still exist. Then, one day, the phantom stepped off the page. A chilling detail comes from a surviving estate inventory preserved in the Gonzales County Courthouse. Next to the list of household property, one line stands out. Slave, Isaac, purchased 1839, returned to owner's account 1841, refused to respond to name. Beneath that, written in a different hand, 3 words, says his name's wrong. Imagine that. A man sold under a false name so many times he stops answering to it, refuses the identity forced on him, and every time a master tries to make him wear it again, he kills them. One descendant of the Pierce family, whose ancestor was among Isaac's supposed owners, later confessed during an interview that his great-grandfather spoke of a quiet one who knew letters better than he let on. The man would sit by the fire after others slept, scratching something into scraps of bark or soot-covered walls. The overseers beat him when they found it, but he kept writing. No one knew what language it was. Some said it was a prayer. Others said it was names. A faded ledger from that same estate holds a small smudge in its corner, letters carved faintly with something sharp, IG. The initials could mean anything. But next to them is a circle drawn by a trembling hand, half finished, as though the man carving it was caught mid-motion. The deeper researchers looked, the more contradictions they found. Eyewitness accounts claimed Isaac was a giant of a man. Others said he was lean, almost sickly. Some said he spoke no English, others that his voice was educated, deliberate. The only consistent detail was his silence when punished, and the strange calm that followed. Lower tone. One overseer's journal reads, "He watched me the whole time I lashed him, like a man waiting for a clock to stop." The next line of the journal trails off into a smear of ink. The overseer was found the next morning near the sugar mill, his head crushed beneath the press. When officials came to record his death, none of the surviving workers would speak. The only statement given was from a young stable boy, who whispered that the man called Isaac walked straight into the dark and that the chains didn't sound like metal anymore. In 1842, the governor's office issued a bounty notice for a fugitive fitting Isaac's description. The document describes a Negro male, age uncertain, eyes light brown, bearing marks of fire upon both wrists. But the strangest detail is the bounty's expiration, 30 days. Such notices usually lasted until capture or death, but this one was time-limited, as if they expected he would disappear again, by design or by arrangement. Somewhere in those 30 days, the official trail of Isaac Granger ends. No further mentions, no arrests, no body. But the name kept resurfacing like a ghost in ink. In 1843, a Louisiana paper reported a steamboat fire on the Red River. Among the casualties listed, a deckhand named Isaac. No last name. Yet the captain's log described the man as educated, soft-spoken, left wrist scarred. That logbook was lost in the same fire that killed the captain's family 2 months later. Another accident. Modern handwriting analysis compared surviving signatures from different county ledgers, those that still bore the name Isaac. Under magnification, the same curvature, the same hesitation before the letter I, the same long descending tail of the G. It suggests the same person wrote his own entries in 3 counties, pretending to be recorded by his owners. If true, that means Isaac didn't just erase his past, he rewrote it in real time, planting evidence of himself wherever he pleased. Like a man sculpting his own myth with the hands that once picked cotton. Whisper, no master owns a name. A statement like that would have been unimaginable in Texas, 1842. To claim your name was to claim your soul. And yet, across decades of paper, the handwriting whispers the same defiance. He made his own record, then made sure no one could prove it. When asked why the state never reopened the investigation, one archivist simply said, "There's nothing to reopen." The man never legally existed, but in the absence of law, there remains the trail, the burned houses, the forged signatures, the name that refused to die. And somewhere between those records lies the outline of a man who learned to use invisibility as a weapon, a man who let others write his story until he decided to write back. The journal was found by accident. A carpenter repairing the decayed walls of an abandoned sheriff's house near Bastrop lifted a loose floorboard and discovered a blackened leather book, edges fused by heat, pages half gone to ash. The ink had bled through in some places, turning words into shadows of themselves. But one sentence survived clear enough to read. He kills only when the whip cracks. The entry was dated April 1844, 2 years after the official report of Isaac's death. The carpenter turned the book over to the county archive, where curators brushed soot from its cover with surgical care. The pages smelled of burnt oil and wet wood, and the binding still held a faint scent of pine resin and something metallic, blood perhaps, or rust. When historians examined it under infrared light, more writing emerged, faint but legible. The first pages were mundane, lists of prisoners, petty crimes, fines. Then abruptly the tone changed. The sheriff began describing sleepless nights, dreams of footsteps outside his window, and sightings of a man in chains moving through the trees. He watches from the dark. One entry reads, "Never speaks, only waits until the sound of the whip." Another, "The Dean fire was no act of God. The tracks led west. I followed them 3 miles before they vanished like smoke." The sheriff never names Isaac outright, but his descriptions match the reports from earlier cases. Tall, scarred wrists, silent, calm. The handwriting grows frantic as the entries progress. The script jagged, letters pressed too hard into the paper. It's as if the man was writing faster than he could think. He records that he set a trap, posted guards, lit torches through the night, but that each morning the dogs were found dead and the chains meant for the fugitive were melted. "Like wax under fire," he wrote. For decades, this burned journal was dismissed as madness, the ramblings of a man haunted by his own failures. But when forensic specialists examined the ink composition, they discovered it contained trace amounts of copper sulfate, a mixture not used in Texas at the time but common in Louisiana trade towns. That detail hinted the sheriff had traveled or corresponded with someone across the border. Folded between two pages, nearly fused by heat, they found a fragment of another letter, addressed to M. Cobb, broker. The letter's first line was still visible. The man you sold walks still. The implications were enormous. If authentic, this meant the sheriff not only knew Isaac was alive, but had been in communication with the very man who had trafficked him. The fire that destroyed the sheriff's office may not have been accidental at all. It could have been an attempt to erase evidence of their correspondence. The sheriff's name was Thomas Holt, a former militia officer known for his strict adherence to order. Town records describe him as pious, temperate, and efficient. Yet after 1844, he disappears. No obituary, no grave, no replacement appointed. His family abandoned the property within months, leaving the house to rot in the humid air. When archivists interviewed descendants of the townsfolk, they told of strange nights in that period, nights when the sky glowed red along the river and cattle were found wandering near the road, eyes glazed, as if they'd been frightened by thunder that never came. The older generation spoke of a curse, that a man wronged by the lash had sworn to repay pain in kind, one mark for another, one flame for one. The sheriff's journal suggests something less supernatural and more deliberate. He writes of hearing whispers in the jailhouse at night, of doors creaking though no wind blew. He claims he smelled smoke though no fire burned. The repetition of these sensations suggests guilt, perhaps complicity. Some researchers believe Holt might have purchased Isaac himself, intending to claim the bounty. If so, his silence after the fire would make sense. One passage, barely legible through the soot, mentions a boy with eyes too old. It reads, "He stood by the river." I asked who he waited for. He said, "For the man who carries the fire in his hands." The handwriting stops there, interrupted by a thick smear of ink. That line became the obsession of later historians, who wondered if the boy might have been a witness to Isaac's survival, or a warning left for the sheriff himself. The material evidence backs the story's timeline. The paper fibers date precisely to the early 1840s, and the burn marks indicate the book was exposed to fire while closed, meaning it survived the destruction of the building intact. Forensic odor analysis detected traces of animal fat, used at the time in lantern oil. The theory is simple. Holt kept writing until his last moments, the journal resting beside the lantern that would soon ignite the blaze. Modern investigators mapped Holt's last known movements from the fragments of his entries. He visited a plantation outside Bastrop 3 days before the fire. Its owner, Caleb Rowe, reported strange thefts from his property: chains, lamp oil, even writing supplies. Rowe's letter to the sheriff ends abruptly. "If you do not come soon, he will take more than iron." 2 nights later, the plantation burned to its foundations. No bodies were found. Among the ruins, local searchers found a melted badge. The metal was twisted beyond recognition, but the outline resembled the sheriff's star. Inside the house's stone hearth lay the remains of 2 books, one of them matching the sheriff's journal, the other unknown. Both bore the same pattern of scorch marks, suggesting they'd been stacked together. But only one survived. To this day, no one knows who set the fire. Theories abound. Some say Isaac returned to erase Holt, fearing exposure. Others believe Holt burned the place himself, unable to live with what he'd seen or done. But the recovered pages hint at something more ambiguous. Near the end, the sheriff writes, "He told me there are men who think freedom is to walk away. He said freedom is to make the fire follow you." The line ends there. That phrase would echo through regional folklore for generations. Some used it to warn children about vengeful spirits. Others claimed it was a code phrase among escaped slaves, guiding one another through hidden routes. Light a torch, and the next will follow. But in the journal's context, it reads as confession, a sheriff acknowledging that he'd seen something he couldn't control. When the journal was first exhibited at the Texas State Museum, visitors reported feeling uneasy, as though someone were watching from behind the glass. The case fogged over from the inside within hours. The curator later joked that the book still remembers smoke. Experts studying the handwriting noticed something impossible. On the final page, a signature appears twice. The first, T. Holt, matches the sheriff's known hand. The second, fainter, in different ink, written beneath it, simply reads, "Isaac." The strokes are deliberate, smooth. The the same as those found on the forged plantation ledgers. If real, that means the journal changed hands before the fire. Someone, possibly Isaac himself, signed it. And if he did, then the blaze that consumed Holt's house was not an ending, but a ritual erasure, the same pattern seen again and again wherever he went. Burn the paper, bury the truth, leave a single trace, a name to haunt the next man who tries to own it. No one can say how the book survived the flames. Some argue Holt hid it under the floor just before the fire started, perhaps knowing his end was near. Others claim the survivor, whoever set the fire, placed it there deliberately, a message for whoever would find it decades later. The soot that sealed its edges preserved its words like a fossil of fear. The burned journal stands as the only first-hand account linking the myth of Isaac to an official's final moments. Every name, every date written inside corresponds to real places, real deaths, yet the man himself remains vapor, seen only by those who didn't live to tell it. And through the pages, his voice bleeds into Holt's until they sound almost the same. When read aloud in sequence, the journal's last 3 lines form a rhythm, almost like a chant. The lash breaks. The fire wakes. The name takes. The handwriting wavers, letters trembling as if written by 2 hands, one guiding the other. Then silence. The rest of the page burns away into black. The witness who vanished was never supposed to be part of the story. His name appeared once, scribbled on a court list that was never filed. Thomas Bell, age 19, overseer's son. No other records existed. But his journal, found decades later in an attic above a church in Louisiana, opened a new corridor in the mystery of Isaac, a man Texas had already declared dead. The journal's first entry began in 1844, 2 years after Isaac's supposed execution, and yet it spoke of him in the present tense. Bell wrote, "The tall one walks again. The men whisper his name, but none say it aloud. He was seen by the river, still wearing the chains." That line alone unraveled the neat conclusion Texas had built around the slave who killed every master who tried to own him. At first, it seemed like another ghost story passed through generations of frightened men, the kind Southern nights tend to nurture. But the language in Bell's writing was different, not mythic but descriptive, detailed, intimate. He wrote of Isaac's walk, of the way he avoided lantern light, how he spoke softly to animals, how he would not touch food unless he cooked it himself. He described the man's hands as calloused like a plow but clean as a preacher's. It was the kind of observation one can only make up close. Bell had not just heard of Isaac, he had seen him. And that changed everything. The entries grew darker as the days passed. Bell mentioned that his father, the overseer, had worked for a plantation owner in northern Louisiana who had recently bought a group of escaped men from Texas bounty hunters. Among them a tall, quiet one who never spoke of his past. The overseer thought the man looked too strong for his own good, and he put him to work moving timber and running the steamboat dock. Bell wrote that his father came home one night, face white, mumbling that the man's eyes were wrong. Not fearful like the others, but knowing. A week later, his father disappeared. His horse returned with dried blood on the saddle and a broken bridle. The town sheriff searched the nearby woods and found only a pile of ashes near the riverbank. Among the ashes lay an iron cuff, still hot, bent as if pried apart by human hands. The official report said the overseer drowned. Bell's mother said nothing. Bell himself stopped writing for nearly a month. When he resumed, his tone had changed completely. The handwriting was jagged, the ink darker, as if pressed too hard into the paper. "He came to me last night," Bell wrote. "He asked me if I wanted to be free. I said yes. He said, then don't lie for them." That line was enough to shake historians. It implied a conversation between the overseer's son and the fugitive slave, years after Isaac's official death. Bell would have been about 20 years old, unarmed, scared, and still loyal to the South, yet Isaac spared him. The implication was chilling. Isaac had no interest in random killing. He was precise, almost moral in his vengeance. He killed only those who profited from chains. Months after that final entry, Bell vanished too. His disappearance was never investigated. Decades later, his descendants claimed he boarded a steamboat headed north under the name Thomas Gray. The ship was never found. The Mississippi swallowed it whole in the spring flood of 1845. But the strangest evidence wasn't Bell's journal. It was what came after. A steamboat registry recovered from the same period listed a crewman under the name Isaac. Gray. The handwriting on the manifest was nearly identical to the handwriting from the sheriff's burned journal 2 years earlier. Both contained the same peculiar G with a loop that never closed. Experts later confirmed the match. It was Isaac's hand. So if Isaac had indeed taken Bell's surname, it meant the two men didn't just cross paths. They might have traveled together. Some speculated Isaac saved Bell from his father's fate. Others said Bell was taken hostage, forced to write under duress. But the tone of the journal didn't fit that. It wasn't fearful. It was reverent. Bell described Isaac as a man who don't belong to this world, but walks it anyway. He wrote that Isaac never raised his voice, that he prayed before every storm, that he once wept while freeing a mule from a collapsed barn. These were not the words of a man writing under threat. They were the words of someone who had seen something extraordinary, something the South was not ready to believe. After the journal resurfaced, archivists began tracing reports from the lower Mississippi around the same time. In multiple towns there were mentions of a tall black man who refused to be bought, who worked briefly then disappeared, leaving behind burned fields or empty shacks. Some called him the Ghost of Texas. Others whispered he was God's knife. None dared to say his name. By the late 1840s, stories about this figure blurred the line between folklore and truth. But the few documents that survived, Bell's journal, the steamboat registry, the burned sheriff's notes, all pointed to one chilling possibility. Isaac didn't die. He evolved. He abandoned the name they branded him with, buried it along with his past, and became something else. Not a fugitive, not a victim, but a symbol the South could not erase. That symbol carried weight. Even decades later, long after slavery was abolished, locals told children to stay away from the riverbanks at night, because the man who walks without chains still passed through when the water was high. No one claimed to see his face, but they all said the same thing, that he walked upright, proud, and silent, like someone who knew no one could ever own him again. The government never reopened Isaac's case. The Texas archives filed his name under unknown fugitive, deceased. Yet, the handwriting evidence, the timeline, the journal entries, and the matching details of the burned homestead all suggested otherwise. The deeper historians looked, the more one truth became clear. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury Isaac's real story. The reports were redacted, property records destroyed, names scratched out, as if erasing him would restore order. But men like Isaac do not vanish in silence. They become whispers that keep order trembling. And maybe that was the greatest terror he inspired. Not that he killed his masters, but that he refused to remain a slave even in death. The South could bury his name, burn his trail, twist his legend into warning tales for children, but it could not kill the idea of him, the idea that one man, born in chains, could make the very system that built them afraid of its own reflection. The ledger was discovered by accident, tucked between two hymn books in the attic of a church that had once served both slave and master. It was dated 1841 to 1844, the handwriting neat and disciplined, belonging to the reverend who had overseen baptisms and weddings in that small Texas parish. The names listed were ordinary: Sarah, Benjamin, Mary, John, until the last page, where a single word appeared in smaller handwriting: Isaac. Next to it, in ink a shade darker and handwriting slightly different, was a signature. No surname, no date, just Isaac. It was written with the confidence of a man who knew letters weren't meant for him, but mastered them anyway. That one stroke of the pen shattered every assumption about who he was. Because slaves weren't supposed to write. Not in Texas, not in 1842. Not under the lash of men who'd die before admitting one of their own chattel could read the language of God. When archivists compared the signature to the charred pages of the sheriff's burned journal found earlier, they discovered something chilling. The handwriting matched perfectly. The same long, deliberate I, the same curved tail on the C, the same rhythm between letters, as though each was written with patience rather than fear. It was proof that the man known as Isaac was literate, and that he had written the very pages describing the deaths of his masters. He wasn't a mere runaway. He was documenting his vengeance in real time, leaving behind fragments like breadcrumbs for those willing to see the truth hidden between history's lies. That revelation reframed everything. The story of Isaac had always been told as the rampage of a slave consumed by rage. But if he could read and write, then his actions weren't instinct. They were intention. Every move was calculated, every disappearance measured. Literacy was rebellion in its purest form, more dangerous than a knife, more powerful than any uprising. A slave who could write was a man who could record what his masters feared most, their sins. And once those sins had witnesses, they could no longer be buried. The burned journal, once dismissed as apocryphal, began to make sense. The entries were written with moral clarity, not madness. Phrases like balance restored and no chain holds in the dark suggested a man who saw himself not as a murderer, but as executioner, an agent of a justice denied to his kind. He didn't write like a victim seeking freedom. He wrote like a judge delivering it. The language wasn't emotional, it was precise. The whip cracked once. That was the sentence. I carried it out. Those were Isaac's words, written in a hand that the state of Texas swore never existed. Experts who examined the handwriting noted something even stranger. It resembled not plantation scribbles or crude marks learned in secret, but formal penmanship, the kind taught in English schools and practiced by clerks. It implied he may have once belonged to an educated master or served as a house servant, where he observed letters long enough to memorize them. But where and how he practiced them remained unknown. Some believed he had help, a preacher's wife, a sympathetic abolitionist, perhaps even a child who didn't understand the danger of sharing a book. But others argued Isaac taught himself, stealing scraps of paper, tracing sermons, learning through imitation. If so, his mastery was extraordinary. The more investigators pieced together his writing, the more it became clear that literacy wasn't just a tool for Isaac. It was his weapon. He used it to manipulate records, to alter names and property logs, to misdirect bounty hunters. Some pages from the archives contained purchase records that had been crudely altered, owners' names rewritten, transaction dates shifted. The handwriting analysis revealed traces of Isaac's distinctive strokes beneath the overwrites. It meant he wasn't just escaping. He was erasing the very paper trail that defined ownership. In a world built on documents and signatures, Isaac had turned their own system against them. One of the most telling discoveries was a letter found in a plantation office near Houston, half-finished, never sent. It began as a standard inventory note from a master to his broker, but ended abruptly after a single haunting line written in different handwriting. You can't sell what belongs to God. The ink analysis matched Isaac's signature from the church ledger. That line, simple, almost biblical, was both confession and declaration. He wasn't just killing men. He was dismantling their belief that a soul could be owned. This revelation transformed the tone of the investigation. Isaac wasn't the savage they'd painted him as. He was educated in silence, dangerous through thought, methodical through learning, and in his literacy, he found a kind of invisible power, the ability to make the truth survive even when his body couldn't. Through writing, he built a ghost of himself that could walk past death, whispering through centuries in ink they could never destroy. The church records revealed another layer of the story. Several of the names listed before Isaac's signature were marked with small crosses, indicating baptisms of slaves. Those names matched the dead from the plantations he'd passed through. It was as though Isaac had returned to mark them in holy ink, rewriting the names of those erased from the earth. Some historians speculated that he used the church not as refuge, but as ledger of remembrance. He was chronicling the ones who'd suffered under his masters, the men, women, and children whose stories ended without note or grave. By signing his name last, Isaac wasn't just revealing literacy. He was claiming authorship over the forgotten. There's an unproven rumor that the reverend who kept the church ledger vanished shortly after those final entries. His replacement, a younger preacher from Mississippi, found the book locked in a chest and sealed it away, warning others never to open it. The church later burned in an unexplained fire, leaving only that attic ledger behind. Every building connected to Isaac seemed to end in flame, as though he or the truth itself refused to let the walls that enslaved him stand. Even after emancipation, old freedmen in nearby counties told their children about the man who wrote his way out. They said he carried no gun, no whip, just a piece of charcoal and a stolen Bible. When asked what became of him, they'd answer the same way. He kept walking north, one word at a time. Whether that was metaphor or memory, No one knows. But the existence of the ledger, the journals, and the forged documents all suggest one haunting certainty. Isaac had mastered the very system meant to own him. Through writing, he made himself untouchable. Through the written word, he became immortal. His masters had power through paper, deeds, bills of sale, ledgers of ownership. Isaac took that same weapon and turned it back on them. Every document he touched became a site of rebellion, every line a quiet act of revenge. And by the time they realized it, their own archives had begun to lie to them. The fire began sometime after midnight, though no one could say for certain how. The nearest homestead was 3 miles from the river, surrounded by oak and dry brush, far from any settlement. When the first smoke was spotted on the horizon, the sky had already turned the color of rust, and the smell of burning tallow spread through the wind like something ancient and wrong. A surviving farmhand claimed he heard the sound first, not a crack or a shout, but chains dragging across wood. Then came the screams, sharp, human, and then nothing but the roar of the fire. By dawn, there was no house left standing. Just iron nails, a broken horseshoe, and the faint outline of footprints leading toward the river. The local paper, the Republic Gazette, published a single paragraph about it 4 days later. Entire homestead destroyed by unknown fugitive. Family presumed dead.
No arrests made. It was dated March 12, 1842. In smaller print beneath the headline,
An editor added, "Witnesses report a Negro man seen walking into the blaze, still in shackles." No name was given, but the description was unmistakable. Tall, scarred wrists, eyes described as cold and quiet, the same words used years earlier by plantation overseers when describing the slave, known only as Isaac. The official report dismissed it as myth, a ghost story told by frightened men. But when investigators revisited that charred patch of land more than a century later, they found traces of iron that had melted at temperatures higher than any normal fire should reach. The sheriff's records from that county were water-damaged, but one page remained legible enough to read a partial sentence. Chains fused. Man unrecognizable. Body not recovered. It was written in the same neat, deliberate script that had already appeared in other archives, the handwriting attributed to Isaac himself. That meant one of two things. Either the sheriff had copied his words from some earlier note, or Isaac had once again been present to write his own ending. Both possibilities felt equally impossible. Forensic archivists studying the incident noted an eerie pattern. Each of the 3 plantation killings tied to Isaac ended in fire. The first, a barn ignited after the overseer's death. The second, a stable set ablaze with horses still inside. The third, this final homestead, consumed completely, leaving no witnesses. It wasn't random destruction. It was ritual. Fire was his punctuation mark, his way of closing the sentence. It erased evidence, yes, but it also purified it, transforming sin into smoke. One historian, writing decades later, described Isaac as the man who used flame as confession. The homestead's owner, a man named Silas Granger, had purchased Isaac only 6 months before the fire. The name Granger caught the attention of researchers immediately, because it was the same surname Isaac had used when first recorded in slave registries years earlier. It raised a disturbing question. Had Isaac chosen the name himself as an act of mockery, or was Silas Granger a relative of one of the earlier masters he'd killed? Letters recovered from Silas's surviving cousin hinted that the Granger family line had a long tradition of trading in slaves, passing them through cousins like inherited debt. Isaac may have recognized the family crest branded on Silas's trunk, the same emblem his first owner had carved into his whip handle. If so, then the fire wasn't random vengeance. It was personal. The night before the blaze, witnesses reported that Silas had punished one of his field hands for insubordination. The whipping post still stood the next morning, its beam cracked from heat. Someone had carved words into it before it burned. The letters were rough, uneven, but still legible. Balance. That single word appeared repeatedly in Isaac's alleged writings. It was how he justified each death. He didn't call it revenge or rebellion. He called it balance, the idea that every lash, every scream, had to be returned with equal weight. Hours before the fire, a neighbor claimed to have seen a flicker of light near the Granger home, as though someone were carrying a lantern down the field path. He thought it was one of the servants. But he later admitted something about the movement disturbed him. It wasn't hurried, but slow and steady, like a man walking toward something he already understood he wouldn't walk away from. When asked to describe the figure, the neighbor hesitated. Tall, he said, still had chains on his wrists, but he wasn't running. By the time help arrived, the blaze had turned the two-story house into a collapsing furnace. In the ashes, they found only two things untouched: a single iron shackle and a burnt page of paper. The page was so blackened it took months of infrared scanning to reveal its faint text. The words read, "Fire doesn't destroy, it remembers." The handwriting, again, was Isaac's. What the page meant, no one could say. Some interpreted it as metaphor, a sign that Isaac saw himself as a spirit of reckoning, destined to repeat until history took notice. Others believed it was literal, that he intended to disappear into the flames, to become myth, knowing that a dead legend would survive longer than a living man. But the absence of his body complicated that theory. If he walked into the fire, there should have been remains. There were none. Not a bone, not a tooth, not even a fragment of cloth. The mystery deepened when, weeks later, a steamboat manifest on the Sabine River recorded a worker under the name E. Granger. He was tall, quiet, missing part of one wrist, and paid in cash. The signature beside his name was faint but eerily familiar. The strokes, the pressure, it was Isaac's hand again. Yet the date of that manifest was 2 months after the fire that was supposed to have killed him. Whether that meant Isaac survived or someone else carried his legend forward remains uncertain. The Texas Massacre, as it came to be called in later retellings, became both cautionary tale and secret celebration. To white landowners, it was proof that rebellion could erupt anywhere, that even one man could destroy a legacy built on ownership. To the enslaved, it was whispered hope, that somewhere out there walked a man who couldn't be broken, a man who turned every lash into fire and every scar into scripture. His name became forbidden in public speech, yet it lingered in slave quarters, murmured between songs and prayers. There's a story, unverified but persistent, told by descendants of those who worked on the steamboats after the war. They claimed that one winter night, as fog thickened over the river, a deckhand found an old book sealed in wax beneath the planks. The cover was scorched, the pages brittle, but inside were entries written in an elegant, steady hand. Each entry began the same way: for the sin of ownership. The final page contained only one line: "The fire is not done." The ink had bled as though the writer's hand was shaking. The handwriting matched the church ledger, the sheriff's journal, and the note from the ashes. That discovery reignited the debate about Isaac's fate. Some argued that he survived, moving from town to town, setting fire to the symbols of bondage long after his supposed death. Others believed his name was adopted by others, each carrying the torch of his story like a ritual passed down. The truth may be simpler and far more haunting. Perhaps Isaac understood that the only way to make his rebellion eternal was to vanish into his own legend. Every time historians try to trace him, the trail ends in flame. Every record that bears his name burns, floods, or disappears. The archives that hold his documents suffer strange accidents: fires, leaks, missing boxes. Even digital scans of his handwriting have corrupted over time, as if something in the data refuses to stay still. Researchers call it coincidence. Others whisper that Isaac still protects his story, ensuring no one edits it but him. The Texas fire was the last time his presence was ever confirmed, yet its echo lingers in more than one place. Some say that if you walk the riverbank at night, you can still smell smoke long after the wind dies, and if you listen closely, you can hear the faint rattle of chains in the distance, not dragging, but swinging, rhythmically, like punctuation at the end of a sentence that never really ended. The letter was found sealed inside a rusted tobacco tin, buried beneath a stone floor in what had once been the master's study. The handwriting was elegant but trembling, the ink faded to brown. It was addressed to a brother in Georgia who never received it. The date read July 8, 1842, 3 weeks after the fire that supposedly claimed every life on the Granger plantation. The opening lines were mundane, comments about the harvest, the rebuilding, the unbearable Texas heat. But halfway down the page, the tone shifted, as though the writer's hand began to shake. "He came to me again," the letter said. "I woke to the sound of the chains. He was standing at the end of my bed, burned but not dying. He said I misunderstood him. He said he doesn't kill for freedom. He kills for balance." The signature at the bottom read, "Silas Granger." Yet what stopped the historians cold wasn't the content. It was the handwriting beneath it. A second signature written over the first in darker ink, smoother and more deliberate. Just one word: Isaac. The two names were layered on top of each other, like two versions of truth fighting for space on the same page. Ink analysis proved the second hand was written with a different nib and ink composition, almost certainly added later. The page had been folded and refolded many times, as if someone kept returning to it. If Isaac had survived the fire, this letter was his last message, left behind in the very house where he had ended his master's bloodline. Archivists called it the balance letter. Its discovery reframed everything they thought they knew about Isaac. Until then, he was a figure of rage and survival, a slave who fought for escape. But this letter revealed something far darker and more deliberate. He wasn't fighting for freedom. He was fighting to restore an order he believed the world had broken. The language of the letter wasn't political, it was spiritual. "The ledger must be even," he wrote in the margins of another recovered page. "Every strike weighed, every debt paid in full." It was as if he had taken the very system used to measure his worth, records, sales, debts, and transformed it into a moral scale of his own making. He didn't reject their world. He rewrote its rules. When forensic readers studied the ink flow of Isaac's signature, they noted something unnerving. His penmanship was steady, confident, but with tiny hesitations in the downward strokes, as if written slowly, almost ceremoniously. The same rhythm appeared in the burned journal, the church ledger, and the scraps of confession found near the river. His hand carried a ritualistic cadence, as though each word were not just written but performed. One historian compared it to scripture, describing it as the handwriting of a man who believed every sentence was judgment. The idea that Isaac had spared Silas, even briefly, haunted those who studied the case. The letter's tone suggested a dialogue between the two men, a night of reckoning rather than slaughter. "He asked if I still believed ownership was a right," Silas wrote. "I said it was ordained." He smiled and said, "Then so is the end of it." That line was underlined twice. After that, the sentences became fragmented, the ink uneven. Silas wrote of smoke seeping under the door, of hearing his own name whispered as the fire spread. He did not run, the letter read. He waited for me to see. It was unclear whether Silas survived long enough to finish writing or whether Isaac had forced him to put his final thoughts to paper as part of his balance. For weeks after its discovery, the letter was treated like relic, a relic that vibrated with too much intent. Researchers who handled it spoke of an unease, an impression that the air changed when it was unsealed. The faint smell of smoke lingered around it, impossible to explain after more than a century underground. And at the bottom of the page, nearly invisible in certain light, was another phrase, pressed hard into the fibers but never inked. "It's your turn." No one could confirm who wrote it. The pressure marks matched Isaac's handwriting again. The discovery made one truth impossible to ignore. Isaac wasn't just erasing his masters. He was communicating with them, forcing them to write their own confessions. Every house that burned, every document that surfaced, carried his mark. It was as though he wanted history to read the truth directly from their trembling hands. To him, murder wasn't chaos. It was a sentence handed down from something higher than man or law. When he said he killed for balance, he wasn't talking about revenge. He was talking about symmetry, about restoring, a moral equation in which every cruelty demanded its echo. Some researchers theorized that Isaac viewed literacy as divine. Power, the ability to define truth itself. If his masters controlled history through writing, then writing became his way of taking that power back. The words of the oppressed became his weapon of equilibrium. In a world where he was recorded only as property, Isaac made sure his own handwriting would become the evidence that outlived every master, and so he signed his name not out of pride, but as an act of burial, carving it onto their letters, ledgers, and wills, overwriting them until their ownership and his defiance became inseparable. After the balance letter surfaced, rumors spread through southern Texas that more of Isaac's writings were hidden in the ruins of plantations, sealed inside walls, beneath floorboards, under altars. Excavations uncovered fragments, but none bore his signature. Still, there were stories. Field workers who claimed to see faint words appear on wood when the air was damp, marks that vanished with the sunrise. One curator swore she saw the ink shimmer faintly when the letter was first exposed to light, as if the name Isaac was written with something more volatile than ink. Psychologists studying the case centuries later suggested that Isaac's obsession with balance was rooted in trauma. The endless cycles of domination and punishment had rewired his sense of morality. Killing wasn't vengeance, it was restoration. Each death was a correction, not an impulse. The handwriting's precision, the calmness of his notes, the ritual fire, all pointed to a mind that saw justice not in emotion, but in arithmetic. For every lash a burn, for every purchase a grave, for every signature another overwritten by his own hand. The haunting part of the balance letter wasn't just what it revealed about Isaac, it was what it suggested about those who studied him. The final page of the document bore faint smudges, fingerprints embedded in soot. When scanned, one of the smudges resembled a partial print identical to another found on the sheriff's burned journal, supposedly written decades earlier. It meant that either Isaac revisited those sites long after their owners had died, or someone carrying his bloodline had. That possibility opened another door. Maybe Isaac's story didn't end in 1842. Maybe it was carried forward by those who found his writings, who understood that fire and ink were two sides of the same rebellion. The archivist who cataloged the letter in 1973 wrote in his notes that after spending nights transcribing the text, he began dreaming of a man standing in the corner of his study, silent, his wrists glinting with broken metal. The archivist described waking to the smell of ash, though no fire had burned. 2 weeks later, the balance letter went missing from the collection, its folder left empty. When it resurfaced a decade later in a private sale, the ink had darkened again, as if it had been freshly written. The final words of the letter, "He kills for balance," became the subject of endless interpretation. Was it a warning, a justification, or a confession? Some read it as prophecy, that Isaac's work would continue until the scales of history were even. Others saw it as madness, the delusion of a man consumed by his own arithmetic. But one line near the bottom refused to fade, written faintly under the overlapping signatures. History only ends when the ink runs dry. Those who've studied Isaac's handwriting claim that line wasn't Silas's. It wasn't written at the same time as the rest of the letter. It appeared to have been added later, perhaps years, perhaps decades after. Whoever wrote it used the same deliberate hand, the same patient rhythm, the same slow downward pressure. And next to it, barely visible, a faint mark, the impression of a chain link pressed into the paper, leaving an outline that caught the light like a signature without ink. Some say it was coincidence. Others believe Isaac had one final message, that the ledger of history remains open, waiting for another hand to finish the sentence he began.